This is the FAA Part 107 Remote Pilot Study Guide for 2025. After watching this video, you'll have the tools and information necessary to successfully pass the FAA Part 107 exam. You'll be able to use your drone footage for real estate, weddings, photography, commercial content, all legally within the United States. This is Drones Beyond. And in this video, we'll discuss in detail all of the information that you'll need to know to pass the Part 107 exam. You'll have multiple choice questions and answers directly from the FAA exam. So let's jump right in. The FAA Part 107 Remote Pilot Study Guide 2025 starts now. What is Part 107? And who is the FAA? And do I really need to study for this exam? Well, the answer to that last question is yes, you do. Well, that's only if you want to pass the test. So let's go to the second question first. The FAA, or Federal Aviation Administration, is a U.S. government agency that manages and regulates civil and commercial aviation while overseeing the safe use of airspace within the United States. They also set standards for airport design, construction, and operation, and their continuing mission is to provide the safest, most efficient aerospace system in the world. And if you just heard that tone and look directly below, you'll see I'll be putting the questions and the answers as it pertains to the section of the video that you're viewing. Now on to the next question. FAA Part 107 is a Federal Aviation Administration rule that governs the operation of small unmanned aircraft systems. The acronym is SUAS, also known as drones, that have a takeoff weight of less than 55 pounds. And question 2 is now up, but the key thing to remember is that the key words here are less than 55 pounds to comply with Part 107. Drones that weigh exactly 55 pounds or more are governed by a different regulation. How about a drone that weighs exactly 55 pounds? And no, this drone cannot be registered under Part 107, and the drone must weigh less than 55 pounds in order to be considered as Part 107 registration. Now, I hope that this precise explanation allows you to get a 100 score on your exam, and the links are conveniently available for you in the video description. Now let's discuss the FAA registration process in detail. Part 107 applies to every drone operator or the remote pilot in command, and the acronym is RPIC. And registration of the drone with the FAA is the responsibility of the remote pilot in command, especially if the drone is used for commercial or civil operations under Part 107. And to give you a quick tip, any question on the exam that you see that pertains to safety, flight operations, risk management, resource management, hazards, or potential flight risks, the correct answer will always be the responsibility of the remote pilot in command. And if you're operating a drone that weighs 0.55 or less than 55 pounds, you will need to register it with the FAA, and the registration is valid for 3 years. The cost is only $5 per drone. Now, you can do this simply by going to FAA Drone Zone. Here is where you'll be able to register your drone, apply for airspace authorization, and also apply for an operational waiver and much more. But for you recreational flyers out there, you can also take the Recreational UAS Safety Test, or TRUST for short. This test is required by law for all recreational flyers. So don't worry, there's no need to study for this one. It's a guaranteed pass. And as you can see, there are many FAA approved websites where you'll be able to take this test online. Now, in regard to registration for a drone weighing less than 0.55 pounds, meaning that it is under 250 grams. And in this case, you are not required to register this drone if you are flying it recreationally, but if your intention is to fly this drone commercially, meaning that you will be making money or have some sort of barter exchange, then you will not only need to register this drone, but you'll also need to pass the FAA Part 107 exam to obtain your remote pilot certificate. Now, an important note in regard to registration is that you must have your FAA registration certificate in your possession when you're operating your drone. It's available to print on paper or access electronically. Now let's talk about something called remote ID, which is also a part of registration as of September 16th, 2023. All unmanned aircraft are required to register the serial numbers of their remote ID drone or remote ID broadcast module, and the only exception is a drone weighing under 0.55 pounds and flying recreationally. Remote ID is a digital system that allows drones to broadcast their identification and location information. So drones flying in areas where they are not supposed to be can be easily located by anyone using a drone locator application. And people authorized to ask you for your registration documentation are aviation safety inspectors, local law enforcement, and air traffic safety specialists. Now, if you've just purchased a new drone, more than likely it's going to have remote ID built in. Location, altitude, and speed will be broadcast. And for those drones that do not have remote ID, you will need to purchase a separate module to broadcast the information. Now, if you're not able to use a broadcast module, don't worry. There's an FAA recognized identification area, or FRIA, where you'll be able to fly unrestricted without a remote ID module. And for more information on this topic, you can simply scan the QR code on the screen and it will take you right to the FAA.gov website. And if you need to purchase a remote ID module, I will have links in the video description. Now, in regard to the younger generation, you will need to be at least 13 years of age in order to register your drone. And if you are less than 13, then your drone must be registered by a person who is 13 years of age or older. Now, in regard to drones that are registered in a foreign country, a remote pilot holding a Part 107 certificate who wants to operate the drone within the United States must register the drone with the FAA. Now, keep in mind that foreign registered drones are allowed to operate in the United States without any additional registration. The remote pilot in command only needs to display the foreign registration number on the exterior of the aircraft. Now, here's an interesting question that probably will not be on the Part 107 exam. How does the FAA regulate indoor drone flights? And what are the rules and regulations? Well, listen to this. The Federal Aviation Administration only regulates outdoor airspace. Therefore, Part 107 does not apply to indoor operations, and that's why you will not see it on the exam. But it's important to keep in mind that you still have the rules of the venue or building owner, safety and injury, privacy, and liability. Now, before we go too deep into this study guide, you're going to need to know where you can get your study materials, right? Well, the FAA website has testing supplements that you will need in order to prepare for this important exam. Click on the link in the video description to download the PDF file for Airman Knowledge Testing Supplement. At the very top right, you should see it says FAA-CT-8080-2H. Now, keep in mind that this is a PDF copy of the actual book, which you can get online also, links in the description. But for the purpose of this video, I'm going to show you the contents so you can become familiar with what's going to be given to you when you're actually taking the test. Now, you must be at least 16 years of age before you will be allowed to take the Part 107 exam. And along with the age requirement, you must be able to read, speak, write, and understand English. And the last requirement is that your physical and mental condition allows for the safe operation of a drone. So now let's briefly recap the contents of what we've already discussed. Part 107 requirements, FAA registration, remote pilot, remote ID compliance, and also the basic rules and regulation information that you will need to pass the Part 107 exam. Lesson 1. Let's go over the basic rules and regulations that you will need to commit to memory. And just so you know, at the end of each chapter in this video, there will be a multiple choice quiz with questions that were taken directly from the FAA exam. Part 107 limits drone operations to a maximum altitude of 400 feet AGL or above ground level. And you're probably asking, why can't I go higher? Well, there's a good reason. Because by limiting the drone operation to 400 feet AGL or below, the FAA creates a buffer zone between drones and manned aircrafts, reducing the risk of mid-air collisions. And at 400 feet or below, the drone operator or the remote pilot in command has a better chance of maintaining visual line of sight, or VLOS, which is required as per FAA Part 107. Now, the speed at how fast you can fly is limited to a ground speed of 87 knots or 100 miles per hour. And if you have this need for speed or a legitimate reason why you need to go faster, then you'll have to apply for a waiver with the FAA explaining why you need to exceed the maximum allowable speed of 100 miles per hour. And you can just about guarantee that this question, either in knots or miles per hour, will be on the exam. 3. SM visibility, and the terminology SM stands for statured miles, and most people think that this refers to how far you should be able to see your drone, but that is not correct. The 3 statured mile visibility requirement refers to the minimum visible distance from the remote pilot's location, meaning that you must be able to see clearly for at least 3 miles in all directions. And if you're wondering how do you determine or evaluate that distance, well, it's very easy. Check the weather reports from nearby airports which provide METAR data. We'll discuss that later in the video, or simply go to the National Weather Service online to determine the visibility in your area. Now, the FAA recommends that you go to aviationweather.gov. From there, you can access information not only in the United States but all over the world, and you'll be able to find METAR reports, ceiling and visibility, clouds, precipitation, thunderstorms, temperature, wind, turbulence, icing, and much more. There'll be a detailed tutorial on how to read this report later in the video, so you'll be able to pass your Part 107 exam. Now, you can pause the video here to review the notes you've taken in the last 10 minutes, and also it will give you an opportunity to subscribe to this channel. 500 feet. This is the FAA rule that you must always remain 500 feet below clouds. Complying with this rule will help you to keep your drone in visual line of sight, which is a requirement by the FAA. So now that you know how far below the clouds you're allowed to fly, how about the horizontal distance away from the nearest cloud when you're flying? That distance is 2,000 feet that the remote pilot in command must maintain a horizontal distance away from the nearest cloud. Now, early in the morning, there's a 30-minute period just before the sun rises, and this is called civil twilight. And during this 30-minute time period, operators must use anti-collision lights to enhance the visibility of their drones for other aircraft, since the lighting conditions may be challenging. And also, after sunset, there's a period of time where the fading light allows for continued visibility. And this 30-minute time period is also civil twilight, and the FAA requires that you must have anti-collision lights during flight. Now, here's something that will be on the Part 107 exam. The FAA requires that your anti-collision lights must be visible for 3 statured miles, and during civil twilight or night operations, the lights must have a flashing or strobing pattern to make the drone easier to identify in low light conditions. Now, another number to remember is $500 damages or injury to personal property or to a person. And what this means is that any accident that results in serious injury defined as requiring hospitalization or property damage exceeding $500 must be reported to the FAA within 10 days. Now, it's important to understand that minor injuries that do not require medical treatment or hospitalization, or property damage that is $500 or less, do not need to be reported to the FAA. Now, any damage, regardless of cause, that was incurred upon your drone also does not need to be reported. So it might be a good idea to have some sort of insurance policy behind you. Now, speaking of policy, if you have a personal policy of having a drink before you fly, well, guess what? FAA Part 107 requires that the remote pilot in command or any crew member involved in drone operations must not operate a drone within 8 hours of consuming alcohol, and this includes the visual observer, or VO as abbreviated. Now, it's important to understand that every crew member plays a critical role to ensure safety according to compliance with Part 107. But just so you understand, the VO's responsibility is to assist the remote pilot in command by maintaining visual line of sight with the drone to ensure safe operations. Now, a key point here is the use of binoculars by the VO, and the VO must primarily use their unaided vision. Binoculars may be used briefly to assist with situational awareness, but not to maintain visual line of sight. And in case you're wondering, the word unaided does not include the use of eyeglasses or contact lenses, which are allowed during drone operations under Part 107 regulations. Now, if you want to know what to look out for in regard to these power lines, well, the FAA Part 107 regulations do not specify an exact distance that drones need to stay away from power lines, but safe operation near power lines is critical to avoid accidents and ensure compliance with general safety requirements. Now, when flying near radio towers with or without guidelines, let me clarify for what you've already heard. Part 107 does not mandate specific distances from guide wires. And though you've already heard about a minimum distance of 2,000 feet from these type of structures, well, that is not entirely correct. The FAA only makes a recommendation that you maintain a minimum horizontal distance of 2,000 feet, but there is no specific statute number or any explicit FAA regulation in Part 107 requiring a 2,000-foot distance from guide wires. It is simply a recommendation to maintain 2,000 feet of horizontal distance, as widely suggested in the aviation community for years. Understanding how difficult it is to visually detect these type of wires is what is going to allow you to avoid any collisions in regard to manned or unmanned aircraft. Now, Part 107 also enforces that blood alcohol content, or BAC, is limited to 0.04%. And again, this pertains to the remote pilot in command and any crew member involved in drone operations. And if you're the type who will refuse to submit to a blood alcohol content test when requested by a law enforcement officer, well, you're not only going to have a bad night, but the FAA will deny your application for a remote pilot certificate or suspension or revocation of your current remote pilot certificate. So do yourself a favor, don't refuse or you'll lose. Now, if you have any relevant drug, alcohol, or criminal convictions within the past year, the FAA can impose penalties that may deny or revoke your drone registration or allow you to obtain your remote pilot certificate. Now, the exam will be 60 questions, multiple choice A, B, and C, and you'll need a 70 score or better to pass. And once you receive your remote pilot certificate, you'll need to renew it every 24 months by taking the online recurrent knowledge test. Now, if you're becoming of age and you really want to get your remote pilot certificate, you'll have to do so when you reach the age of 16. Only individuals 16 years or older can legally act as a remote pilot in command. And if you change your address after you've received your remote pilot certificate, you will have 30 days after the date of move to notify the FAA. Now let's talk about the exceptions for when you can actually fly higher than 400 feet AGL. Part 107 allows drones to fly above 400 feet if they are within 400 feet of any structure. Now, this can be either a building, a tower, a bridge, a skyscraper, or even a mountain. But the key thing to remember is that you can only fly an additional 400 feet above the very top of that structure. So do the math and set your maximum altitude correctly based on your calculations. Now, here's a bit of information that won't be on the exam but might be helpful for recreational flyers. In the United States, the FAA does not specify a minimum age for operating a recreational drone. But keep in mind that there are some age-related requirements for registration and supervision, especially when flying in public or crowded areas. So now, let's move to Lesson 2 and review airspace classification. And in this section, we're going to be breaking down the classes of airspace, controlled airspace, uncontrolled airspace, special use airspace, SAO, and other airspace areas. Now, a good question to ask is, what exactly is airspace? So I'll answer it this way. The FAA defines airspace as a portion of the atmosphere controlled by a particular country or region where the air traffic is regulated. And if you purchased or downloaded the testing supplement inside, you'll find aeronautical sectional charts that designate the different classes of airspace. And don't worry, I'll be going over these charts in detail. But before I do that, there is something that you'll need to understand, and that is, what is AGL and what is MSL? And this is an important question because both of these measurements appear on the aeronautical sectional charts. Now, what you're looking at is a diagram representing the different classes of airspace throughout the United States. And you notice that there's Class A Alpha, Class B Bravo, Class C Charlie, Class D Delta, Class E Echo, and all of these are controlled or regulated airspace. There's no F, but there is a Class G for golf airspace, which is uncontrolled, unregulated. Now, since I just mentioned a few phonetics, it's probably a good idea for you to review and memorize the phonetic alphabet, since it enhances clarity and accuracy in aeronautical communication. And also, the NATO phonetic alphabet is standardized both in the United States and internationally. Now, more than likely, you'll be spending most of your time flying in Class G airspace, and that's simply because all of the other classes of airspace are controlled, and you will need authorization from ATF in order to fly in those areas. And as you can see, AGL, which stands for above ground level, and MSL, which stands for mean sea level, are both indicated on this chart. So here's how you know what AGL actually means. Ground level is a standing point on the surface of a terrain. So AGL is a measurement of altitude above the ground where you stand. Now, MSL, or mean sea level, is an average height of the ocean's surface used as a standard reference point for measuring altitude or elevation. So now that you know what all of this means, let's take a look at Class A for Alpha airspace. Now, if your brain works by process of association, the letter A could mean the airspace above all other airspace. And the important thing to remember is that this is controlled airspace, which begins at 18,000 up to 60,000 feet MSL. And what controlled actually means is that pilots must have clearance and maintain communication with air traffic control, or ATC, at all times. Now, aircraft operating in this airspace can only fly under IFR, or Instrument Flight Rules, which means that pilots must rely on instruments such as altimeters, heading indicators, and navigation radios to determine their position, altitude, and route. And don't worry, you won't be allowed to fly at this altitude because it's basically for commercial airliners. Now let's look at Class B airspace, and again, by association, you can think of the letter B as standing for biggest or busiest airports within the United States. Class B airspace is controlled airspace that surrounds the nation's busiest airports. It is designed to ensure the safe operation of commercial airliners and smaller general aviation aircraft. And as we mentioned earlier, you cannot fly in Class B airspace without authorization from ATC. So if you want to get authorization, you're going to need to download an approved FAA Lance application. And once you have it downloaded and you've created an authenticated account, you can then open the app and select a geographical location of where you want to fly. Each grid on the map will give you a maximum allowable altitude, and once you send it, you'll receive a response back from ATC either approving or denying your request to fly in controlled airspace. Major airports such as Los Angeles, LAX, New York, JFK, Dallas, Fort Worth, Denver, Atlanta, O'Hara International Airport will all be in Class B airspace, which typically extends up to 10,000 feet MSL. Now, going back to the diagram, you can see that it somewhat resembles an upside-down wedding cake with multi-layers, or as they're called, shelves, which expand outwards as the altitude increases. Notice at the bottom layer that there's a symbol of the airport runway. And just so you know, airports in Class B will always have a control tower. And this indicates that there's an area around the airport which is controlled and also begins at the surface level. The upper or outer layers will obviously start at higher altitudes. And this configuration is designed for air traffic control to manage and maintain a high volume of aircraft entering and exiting the airspace. Now, keeping this explanation relatively simple, I'm going to show you what Class B airspace looks like on an aeronautical sectional chart. Now, what I hope you noticed immediately is that the airport is located at the center of all of the outer layers, but what you may not have made an association with is that the layers are all colored blue. So keep in mind that blue solid lines outline the extent of Class B airspace boundaries. Now, something else that you may not have noticed is that there are more than 3 layers. Typically, Class B airspace can have anywhere from 2 to 5 layers, depending on the operational requirements of the airport and its geographical surroundings. I'll be going over the details of these sectional charts later, but for now, let's move on to Class C airspace. Starting at the surface layer, you notice that there's a symbol of the airport again. Typically, Class C airspace has 2 layers. The inner core, which starts at the surface up to 4,000 feet MSL and also has an inner radius of 5 statute miles. And in case you didn't know, radius is measured from the center, or in this case, the airport, out 5 statute miles, and the total diameter will be 10 statute miles. The upper or outer shelf starts at 1,200 feet MSL and goes up to 4,000 feet MSL, and the inner radius extends out to 10 statute miles. So here you have an example of Class C airspace on a sectional chart. Notice that there are 2 layers, as I mentioned, and Class C airspace is represented by solid magenta lines. Now, one thing to point out is that typically the ceiling for both of these layers will be at 4,000 feet, as I mentioned, but you can see here that both the inner and outer layer will extend up to 4,200 feet MSL. The reason that the altitude is higher than I mentioned earlier is because both the horizontal and latitude distances are adjustable based on the specific needs of the airport. And to give you a small preview of the detailed explanation coming later, these numbers inside of each layer represent top and bottom altitude, meaning number 42 is abbreviated for the ceiling of that layer, so you must add 2 zeros to get 4,200 feet MSL. The bottom number 21, which is also abbreviated, add 2 zeros to get 2,100 feet MSL. Now, if you look in the center close to the airport, you will see SFC, which stands for surface in any class of airspace. So this quick lesson allows you to understand that this airport has an inner layer that starts at the surface and extends up to 4,200 feet MSL. Now, Class C airspace accommodates moderately busy airports, and this is to separate the slower aviation aircrafts from the faster commercial or military aircraft. Now, in regard to an unmanned SUAS, the remote pilot in command must get authorization from ATC, and again, this request can be submitted through your FAA-approved LANCE application, or if the controlled airspace that you're in is not supported by the LANCE application, you can submit your request manually by logging into the FAA Drone Zone website. Now let's talk about Class D airspace, which is the airspace that surrounds smaller airports. Class D typically extends from the surface up to 2,500 feet AGL instead of MSL. And the reason for this is because this airspace is specifically designed to manage air traffic within the vicinity of a specific airport. Using AGL ensures that the altitude measurements are consistent with the current elevation of the airport. ATC can manage aircrafts much better because the altitudes are consistent with the surface elevation of each individual airport. Now, before we take a look at the sectional charts, let's take a look at the legends to see which markings identify Class D airspace. And as you can see at the very bottom, the blue dashed lines around an airport will designate Class D airspace. And just as a refreshing reminder, you already know that Class B airspace is the solid blue line and Class C airspace is the solid magenta line. Now, looking at the sectional charts, you can see that the 2 blue dashed lines around the small airports in Sacramento designate Class D airspace, but the one at the very top that is a dashed magenta line, well, that is Class E airspace. Now, stay locked on these study guides because part 2 of 12 will be uploaded next week. See you then.